I started practicing Zen when I was living in Japan as an English teacher. I wanted to try to practice before I went, but I had no real opportunity. And when I got there, I started looking at Zen temples, and I found that there's one Zen temple in all of Japan that had an English speaking non Japanese abbot, and it was only like an hour's drive away. So I just really started practicing that way and basically continued from that point on. Once I started out on the path, it just kept going. So I practiced in America, in different places in Asia, but primarily in Japan. And found my way back to one of my earliest teachers after wandering in a lot of different places, and decided to ordain there and went through monastic training in Japan. So that's my path to eventually becoming Tenku. Yes. So when I came back from Japan to the United States, I realized I hadn't really learned how to work with my emotions very well. So that was my primary motivation for wanting to do chaplain training, and also for learning about Tibetan Buddhism. I wanted some tools and some ways to work with emotions, not only for myself, but for the people I was interacting with. So I trained as a chaplain, and I found that I really love the work. And what I love about it is I meet everybody and find out who they are based on their own spiritual journey, their own spiritual views, not mine. And so I get to hear everybody's stories. When people are having a hard time, they share their stories, because they're suffering. And so that's what really drew me in, was I get the chance to meet people I never would have met in any other way. People who are Christian, people who are Jewish, people who are Muslim, people who are not religious, everybody. And I get to learn what their spirituality is for them. And then that really informs me on my path. So that's what I love about it, and that's what makes it feel really meaningful to me. So I was really drawn in. In our chaplain training, we learn how to work with our own stuff, our own emotions, our own discomforts, how to have difficult conversations, and how to be present to people when they're really suffering. And once I started trying that with people, I found that I really loved the work, and I kept going from there. So it's helpful not just, going into the hospital and meeting people there, but in my everyday interactions with just my neighbors or my family, different people. Yeah, it really depends on the situation. But the most important thing is to walk through the door and really meet them from the heart. And there's really just one chance to do that. The first time we meet somebody, we have to connect. And when people are in the hospital and, they're scared or they're worried, and that's when the conflict tends to rise up, they really need to understand that somebody in this can be neutral, can be loving, and can be grounded. So that's how I come in. And when I come in that way, it means letting go of my stuff, my own self, my own ideas, my own prejudices, and meeting them where they are. So in doing that, as an official person, as the chaplain in the hospital, I have some authority. And so I use that to their advantage. It helps me to get the brother who's angry to sit down and talk to the sister. So I use that somewhat. But I think we can do that, whether or not we're in a role, by first and foremost showing up from a place of heart. Because sometimes when we're angry, we forget how much we love each other. We forget this is that person that I care so deeply about. We get so clouded by our stories of them that we forget, where our connections are. We can remember that and start there, sit down, and then more slowly start telling our stories and unpacking and deeply listening. Then we can learn to really show up and hear what people are saying. So when I work with families who are in a lot of conflict, and I do this frequently, I find that I'm not afraid. Why? Because it's not about me. It's their conflict. It's not mine. I'm not afraid. And that I really enjoy, or maybe not, I find it very satisfying to sort of find not this person's story or this person's story, but the whole story, and to start to tie that together. Oh, you're afraid that your mom won't be cared for. Oh, you're afraid that people are going to judge you. And there's the mom, in the middle. She's afraid that her children are suffering. And so how can we pull those stories together and make a complete story, rather than just the me and my story, you and your story? And I think that's the essence for how to come together during times of conflict. So we never know the full story. Even when we think we do, we don't know everything. There are so many things we can't see, even about ourselves. So if we can show up, with our story and with the ability to connect from the heart and to listen to the other person's story fully, we can learn things. If we can just be a little curious, he's telling a really different story than what I think. We have a couple of choices. We can get angry, or we can shut down, or we can become curious and really take it in. We don't have to believe everything they say. Maybe your brother is saying something, that's not true. But within that, there could be little sparks of truth that you can find, just little things. Oh, I get it. What I'm hearing from you is that you're trying your best to take care of mom. You've been working really hard. You've been feeling inadequate in this, and you want to be appreciated. So this is what happened with my own brother recently. I felt like I was left out of the story of how to take care of my mother and father who live far away from me. And my brother, who's right there, felt overworked, too much burden on him. And so here we are in different situations. So how are we going to come together? The way we came together is, finally he agreed to talk, and we talked. And as we talked, we started to come closer and closer together. And what I learned was how heavy it had been for him to try to carry everything on his own. Because he wasn't accepting help from me or from others. He felt like he had to do it all by himself, as the son who's taking care of the parents. And how much he didn't know, and he was trying his best to do. And then what he learned from me was that I could hear that, and that I was supporting him. I wasn't judging him. I really felt all that he was doing and appreciated it. And I didn't expect him to do it perfectly, because nobody can do this perfectly. We have to just keep trying and, messing up and trying again and messing up. So through that conversation, it became from, you're not keeping me in the loop. You're not telling me what's going on with my dad who's on hospice and dying. And you don't know what I'm going through, to, well, you did tell me some things, and, well, let me tell you what I'm going through. And I care about my dad. I care about my dad too. And then finally, I care about you. And I care about you too. And we were able to come together.
What about the situations where those conflicts have come and gone? You know, there's a long family history, and when you're facing a conflict, it's actually about all different kinds of other things that were never expressed, especially in a context where confrontation is not welcome, a culture that avoids confrontation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. When you have a history with somebody, it just goes forever, right? It goes back to that time you were kids and your brother put peas up your nose or, whatever. We really have to use our practice to come into the present. We have to use our ability to let go. And our practice teaches us how to do that. When we sit meditation, we follow our breath. At its core, we follow our breath. When thoughts arise, we notice them and we let them go and we return to our breath over and over and over. So we can use our practice and that not perfection of getting rid of all of our thoughts, but that coming back, trying again, coming back. It's that the process that's important, not some perfect outcome. So when we try this with our practice, we're teaching ourselves how to do this in life. So in the case where family members have this long history, we can start to let go of this long story because the reality is they're not going to change. This has gone on forever, but we can still find things in this moment that we can connect on. We can still find something in this moment. I think of this a lot with my sister. My sister's younger than me, so she was always my baby sister. In fact, when she was first born, I told the kids at elementary school about her. I was so happy. And she got kind of stuck in that role of baby sister. I have to take care of her. And you know what happened? She grew up and she became an adult woman. But in my mind, she was stuck as baby sister. And she didn't much appreciate that because she was a grown person. So at some point, I don't think I was conscious that I was making her into someone who's permanently a baby or permanently younger than me. But I was hurting her. And I started to notice how that showed up. How did I notice? Well, she doesn't like to fight. So I would notice in some times, say she's cooking. And I would notice that I was correcting how she cut the tomatoes. And that I noticed that she had been talking to me before that. And she started to become quiet. And then she turned away from me, put the knife down and turned away. And the conversation kind of stopped. So if we are paying attention and if we're willing to engage, even when people aren't talking, we can pick up on those clues, right? She stopped talking. Maybe I did something. Maybe I said something. What did I do? Oh, look at that. I was criticizing how she was cutting up the tomatoes. Well, what if instead of being always my baby sister, my little sister, what if she were my friend? Would I talk to her that way if she were my friend? How could I talk to her in a way that's different? And so then I started trying it out. Talking to her in the same way I would talk to a friend. And you wouldn't criticize your friend for how they cut the tomatoes, You would just talk to them while they're cooking. And yeah, they might do it in a strange way that you're not used to. But you just sit there Or you might even say, oh, wow, you cut your tomatoes so much differently than me. What's going on there? So when I started treating my sister that way, our relationship really shifted into an adult relationship. And I think we can bring this into, any situation. We can't make our family our friends. We can't just magically get rid of everything. But we also can't go back in time and fix every little thing that they've ever done to us. We have to see them as, the continuum of a human life. And at the core, everybody is doing the best that they can. We have to believe that. Everyone is trying. Everyone is doing the best that they can in their own unique ways. So when we get stuck in our story of what we think is best, that keeps us out of relationship with people. So not everybody's good at everything. And not everybody does everything right all the time, including us. But accepting all of the quirks and the weirdnesses and the things we like and the things we don't like about people helps us to come into a better relationship with them as a whole human being and really start to see them as Buddha. We see in others the Buddha nature in me reflected back. When we start to see this, then we have no choice but to really be present for them, where they are, as they are. My teacher often teaches that, he always says, we can't bow to ourselves. And he always wants us to try it. So he says, put your hands together and try bowing to yourself. And if you try it, maybe some yogis can do it, but it's kind of impossible because once you start to bow, you're bowing to the other person. So he says what we do is the Buddha nature in me bows to the Buddha nature in you. And when you do that to me, you bow to my Buddha nature. Then we meet. This is Buddha meeting Buddha. This is how we start to really love and accept each other as we are in our imperfections.
What can we do about the parts of ourselves that have been hurt by the other in those relationships?
Yeah, that's a hard question. Ignoring it is not ignoring the parts. Ignoring the hurt isn't really a good option. Our practice really can help us to be present to that hurt and understand that it's dynamic, and to be present to that tenderness without seeing it as permanent. So what can we do for the parts of ourselves that have been hurt? First we have to identify them. So as we sit, things come up. We feel things in our bodies. Sometimes we feel physical pain. Sometimes we feel emotional pain. Notice where it is. And then, because we've been practicing following our breath and learning to stay present, then we also can stay present to our feelings when they come up. And this helps us to identify what it is. This tenderness here, what's going on there? Does it have a color? Does it have a shape? Is it big? Is it small? Is it hard? So once we have found those feelings, then we can start to breathe in some spaciousness into them. So we start with ourselves. And then, when we start to become more aware of our own feelings and all the complexity around them, we can start to open to expressing those feelings or sharing them in relationship with others. We don't have to start, from the hardest thing. We can start from something very small and try it out and see how it goes and learn from that. It takes so much bravery to name something that somebody's done if we're not used to that. And, certainly in my family, we don't talk about our emotions. So it's kind of like you pretend that it never happened, but then you sort of remember it. So how can you try it? Try it out very gently. You can try it out with curiosity. Hey, the other day when you said, Tenku, you always put the knife in the wrong place. I was curious what's going on for you there. Would you be willing to talk about that? So, I felt a little bit of pain when I heard that. and you find your way in. You can find your way in. And then see if they're willing to talk. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. I think if we start small, people are often willing to talk. And then when we start really small, then we start to build up the kind of relationship that lets us talk about bigger things. Recently, I went to visit my dad, who is he's now on hospice. And my dad really doesn't talk much. He's a very quiet person, and he doesn't share his emotions. But, when I wanted to know if he's okay. And so I sat down next to him, and lately he can talk a little bit more than he could in the past. So I sat down next to him, and I started off just talking about other things. Hey Dad, how you doing? Remember the time we did this? And then I brought in, remember the time when Grandma was really sick and the two of us drove over to see her? And he was like, yeah, that was hard, wasn't it? And I answered, yeah, that was hard. So see, we've sort of come in. And eventually I was able to say, Dad, how are you doing? And he was able to answer it. He said, I think this is the sickest I've ever been. We have a choice at that point. We can turn away and say, oh, no, Dad, you're fine. Everything's going to be fine. But we both know that everything is going to be fine in a different way. We both know that he's dying. So I can either say, shut down, Dad, no, or I can change the subject. Oh, the dog just came in, let me know something different. But I can also make a choice to show up. So when my dad said, I think this is the sickest I've ever been, I sat there and I said, yeah, I think so, Dad. And then we sat in silence for a few minutes. And then I asked, what do you think's going on for you? And he said, well, I don't know. So then I asked, well, Dad, do you think you are closer to the beginning of your life or to the end of your life? And so then he makes a joke and he said, well, I'm 114 years old, so I guess I'm getting toward the end. And he's not really 114, he's only 80. Then we laughed, and I said, yeah, you're 114 years old, then that's pretty close to the end. And then I said, how do you feel about that, Dad? And he sat for a long time, and enough time that I was a little starting to be uncomfortable. But like I mentioned before, we can come back to our practice and cultivate the ability to stay still, to stay present, even when we feel uncomfortable. And I felt very uncomfortable. I felt sad. I would do anything to change it, to make him better, to make him not sick, to make him not sad. And finally, he took an out breath and he looked at me and he said, I'm at ease with it. That moment with my dad is one of the most precious moments I have ever had with him. Hearing him say, I'm at ease with it, was so beautiful. We were so connected and it was so profound. If I had changed the subject or turned away from that, I would have missed that connection. I think this is how we can connect, with anybody. Even when things are hard, when we feel sad, when we feel angry, when we're just uncomfortable, or even we don't know what to say, we can find ways through. And if we can stay with it, building up that relationship and building up our own courage to talk about the difficult things, then we can have a much deeper relationship. We get off of the surface and we go down a layer. There's a social work researcher called Brené Brown, and she often says we can choose discomfort or resentment. And what she says is if we choose 10 seconds of discomfort, it can save us years of resentment. Discomfort. So she says when somebody says something that feels a little hard to answer, she'll count, like telling herself, choose discomfort over resentment, choose discomfort over resentment, choose discomfort. And she's building up her courage, right? And she's getting like, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. Choose discomfort over resentment. And finally she'll say, that felt a little sharp when you spoke to me that way. I'm wondering, could we have a coffee and talk a little bit? And then they talk. And then she saved herself several years of holding that story. So we can do this even with our own families, where the stories are so stuck. And we don't have to go back and try to fix all the old stories. But as we create new stories, we don't have to stay stuck in the old patterns. We can choose a few moments of discomfort, using our practice, using our ability to really meet others. With bravery, taking our own fears and turning them into compassion. We can learn to show up even for the most challenging things. And as we do this, the story changes. Even the most stuck stories start to change little by little if we can stay with it. And this is how we really, with our own families, this is how we learn to, engage when things are hard. So I think as soon as we start doing that, the relationship goes to a deeper place. As we've gotten off the surface and finally talked about something hard, we go to a deeper place and everybody feels how much more connected they feel in that deeper place. And then we start to see the benefit of it. Even if we didn't like the discomfort, we can start to appreciate the benefit of going a little deeper in our relationship. So if it's possible, we can try, and there's no harm in trying. And we might not always succeed, but we can keep trying. We don't have to decide, I'm done. We can keep coming back to it.
Could you speak a little bit about that sense of inadequacy that can come up when we're the caretaker for someone who's going through something very difficult or facing dying or struggling with their own feelings around dying.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I was just thinking of it the other day. We want so much to help, but our idea of helping tends to move towards fixing, and fixing isn't possible. So when we're oriented towards fixing, we're actually taking ourselves out of the moment, in the moment when the suffering is happening. So we're sort of like so uncomfortable with the way things are, we want to fix it and make it better. If we can pull back a little bit and stay present in our feelings of inadequacy, then we start to realize that maybe fixing isn't what's needed. You know, this comes with caring for people, comes with our relationships. You know, when we don't know what to say, it can come with, you know, pretty much any human relationship. And my mom was just talking about this the other day, actually. My mom has dementia, so she's not able to do everything for my dad that she used to. But he wants her to do things for him still. So the other day, he really, he needed her help. He wanted to move. He was in bed and he was lying there and he has some bed sores, so he gets in pain. And so he was calling out. He was like, help me, help me, help me. And she's like, I want to, but I'm not allowed to. And she felt so inadequate. And so things got a little, you know, tense between them. And she started to cry and he got angry. And she left the room for a minute and got the nurse to come in and help, which was fine. And then later she said, you know, I felt so, I wanted to help, but I wasn't allowed to help, and I didn't know what to do. And I want to talk about this with you because, you know, I love you so much, and you got so mad at me. And so one of my mom's friends, a woman who's 92 years old, they all sat down together and they talked with this 92-year-old woman, Anita, helping. And Anita helped them to say, you know, Mary, can you say what was going on? And she said, you know, I wanted to help. And I felt like a bad wife for not helping. And I didn't know what to do. I don't want you to be in pain. And then she turned to my dad and she said, Frank, what was going on for you? And he said, I like it when Mary, my mom, takes care of me because I feel loved. And these days I just lay there in bed all the time and I feel so alone. You know, she goes out, she walks the dog, she goes out to meals, and I just have to sit there and I feel so lonely. And, you know, I just wanted her to come in and take care of me. So then based on that conversation, you know, my mom was able to say, I feel inadequate. And then she was able to back up what's underneath that. And then my dad was able to say what was going on for him. They came to some way of being together that was a new way. You know, it wasn't that old pattern of being angry and wanting to fix, being angry, wanting to fix. But the new pattern was, oh, okay, you feel lonely, I feel inadequate, what can I do? So my mom decided to move her chair into the same room with my dad and sit with him and just be with him, you know? And all she had to do was move a chair from the other room. If they hadn't talked about this, if my mom hadn't been able to say how she felt, I don't know if they could have come to this. But like I said before, you know, talking is not always out of the mouth. There's so many clues we can pay attention to. Clue, you know. If a sick person is feeling angry, maybe they have a need that's not being met. If a caregiver is feeling really sad and crying, maybe they have a need that's not being met. You know, it's not all about just being sad or being angry. There's usually more to the story. How can we find the clues that bring us better together? So I don't know if that answers your question enough. It's a start because it's such a big question. Yeah. I think we all feel inadequate, don't we? Sometimes. I certainly do. I remember, trying to take care of people during the COVID pandemic in the hospital. And I go into their room, as the chaplain, and I've got on all this stuff. I've got something over my head. I've got a plastic thing on my face. I have 2 masks on. And the first mask takes all the air out so people can't hear me. And then I have this plastic gown and gloves, and my shoes are covered. Everything is covered head to toe. And then the person is lying there in the bed, and their voice is really weak because they have COVID. They don't have much air. And often they were older. And you know what? They didn't have their hearing aids in, and they couldn't hear very well. And even if they could hear, then remember I said the mask blocks my mouth. And then what else happens? The rooms are loud because a lot of people are on oxygen, and that makes a loud noise. And sometimes the roommates are on the phone, maybe they're talking to their family in their own country, or their family at home because their family can't visit them. So I felt so inadequate. I just want to sit here and I would like to help you. I would like to talk with you. I would like to hear your story and hear about your suffering. And you know what? That was not available to me in that moment. So I have 2 choices. I can either get stuck in myself and my own feelings of, I don't know what to do, or I can show up for what I have. And I decided to show up. Even if people don't speak English, I could sit down next to them. I could sit down next to them, and with my gloves on, I could hold their hand. And you know what? Nobody else could do that. The nurses were too busy. The roommate's far away. Their family can't come into the room. So out of my feelings of not knowing what to do, just sitting there, just being present is something we can do. Sometimes we think of that as not doing, but just being present is the most beautiful gift we can give. I can talk about the fear. So I got COVID myself when the pandemic first started, when it first came to the United States. I got it in March, and it's quite frightening not to be able to breathe. I don't know if everybody knows this, but not being able to breathe is scary, that you can't get oxygen, but it's also physiologically, it causes fear because the carbon dioxide builds up in your system, and that starts a fear response. So I had felt that in my body. So when I was at the hospital and starting to care for patients with COVID, the first time I went into one of the rooms, it took so much bravery for me to be able to do it. And I remember that I checked everything several times. I was like, I'm going to do it. And I put on all the stuff, and then one of the nurses inspected me. She said, turn around. And then she, adjusted the ties and fixed it. And then I said, Laura, do I look okay? And she said, you're good. You can do it. And that really helped me to realize that, I'm not doing this on my own. Somebody's watching out for me. So It doesn't have to be me by myself facing my fears. And also, this person who just helped me, she's been in those rooms for a lot longer than I have, so she knew how to do it. I could rely on her expertise. And so it was more like the support of everybody that helped me to face my own fears on that level. And so I went in and I met the most lovely person. He could talk, and I heard his story. He was a psychologist. He took care of children who had been abused. Just really lovely human. And I started to feel an opinion coming in. And my opinion was, I don't want him to die. He's a lovely person. He doesn't deserve to die. And all of that was true. He was a lovely person, and he did not deserve to die. And so the next day when I went, I was happy to see him. I was excited about seeing him again. And he was lying in bed, and his breath was like this. And I recognized that in my own body. And I was like, oh, he's really sick. He's really sick. And I didn't like it. And then I felt the fear come in at that point. And so on that day, I stood outside of the room and I just stayed with him. You know, I made a motion. There was a glass door that he could see me. And he said like this. And I said, I'm here. And he said, thank you. And that was enough. So that was how I faced my fear on that day. Simply finding the place where I could be and showing up right there. You know, we don't have to be superheroes. We don't have to do more than we're able to do. And even if we try to push ourselves, then we can, we can cause harm. So on that day, I pulled back just a little bit and fully showed up where I was in my own fear. And he saw it. And then the next day I was able to go in. And I would say that this is how I faced my fears through the whole time. I learned that we were all watching out for each other. One day I started to go into a room and I didn't have all the plastic stuff on that you put on. I had on just the regular mask, which I always wear, and face shield, but I didn't have all the gown and all the things that you need to go into a COVID room. So I opened the door and I started in, and one of the nurses from further up, she was like, Tenku, stop. And it turns out they had forgotten to put the sign on the room that said COVID patient. But what I learned in that moment was somebody's watching out for me. And so then, I could develop more trust. And that trust helped me to feel less afraid about going in. And then later, I was sitting there, writing up my notes from seeing a patient, and I saw somebody open the door. It was this guy, Carl, and I was like, Carl, stop, don't go in. And so I was able to pass it forward. And then Carl was able to feel, less fear because he knew that he was protected. And I think this is how we do, not just with COVID, but in the whole world. When we can really focus on shifting from, I'm going to be hurt, what's going to happen to me? When we shift that to, how can I show up for you? How can I make you feel more safe? Then that takes us out of our own fears and into a place of compassion. When I studied to become a chaplain, my supervisor had us learn primarily about grief, because her way of teaching was everybody's going through grief at some point in time. And when we're sick, when we're in the hospital, that grief starts to come up. The grief can come up just from sometimes people coming in because they broke their arm. But then the next thing you know, they're remembering the time they brought their mom into the hospital and she didn't leave, and she died there. So anything can bring up grief, but definitely suffering is going to spark grief. So these are the stories that we can hear from each other. You know, the person who's sick themselves, sometimes they're remembering the time that they cared for their mom. And the person who's caring for them, often their main story isn't this person at this time, but, you know, the time that they were a little kid and their grandma died. So this is all this very complex web of human emotions. And when it happens, we can shut down to it and say, oh, no, I don't want to feel this, you know, I'm feeling sad, I can't feel sad, I have to stay positive for this person. But we know when people are being fake. We know, like in our gut, you know, we can feel when somebody's not genuine. We don't have to necessarily go all the way into the story, but we can also name it. And so when we're taking care of somebody, it's very natural that we would feel grief coming up, whether it's for them or from memories of our mom and, you know, when my mom was sick. And we can weave in those stories into the fabric of how we care for each other. We can tell the stories sometime, or maybe a friend is willing to listen to those stories, and we can acknowledge it to ourselves too. You know, and that's so important, just to acknowledge it. Even if we don't tell the whole story, but just to say, oh wow, I'm feeling really sad today. Okay, I'm feeling really tender. Oh, this is the day, this is the death anniversary of my grandma. And then if you're with them, you could ask, oh, what was your grandma like? Oh my goodness, she was hilarious. She was always doing something crazy. She wore bright red lipstick. She really loved baking, but I made her a little bit chubby, you know, so this is my grandma. And then you get the story, and then you can say, oh, I can see you really miss her. You really miss her. And I could say, yeah, I do. And just this is enough. It's very natural when our hearts are open, broken open, that we would think of other sadnesses. And within those, you know, the fabric of those sadnesses is so much more. There's a whole human life in there. There's a whole human experience that all goes together. And when I allow you to share your grief, then my own grief can also be touched, and that can come into the story too, whether I say it out loud or not. It's all here. And this is what it means to be fully human. We don't have to shut down, but we don't have to get stuck either. You know, because we're sad in one moment doesn't mean we're sad forever. Even 5 minutes later, we could be laughing, just like I was about my grandmother, you know, remembering her bright red lipstick and the way she liked to bake sweets all the time just made me happy. So in the middle of something, in the middle of grief, can be sadness, can be confusion, can be joy, can just be appreciation. But grief isn't a thing. Grief isn't this hard, you know, rock. It's a process that moves and grows. And in the middle of it, there's a lot of beauty. Staying present and paying attention and letting it move, you know, can open us to the beauty of the human experience. Yeah. And I'd like to also, you know, I'd like to talk about that too. Sometimes we think, you know, we should be sad. I should be sad, and I keep doing this because it feels so stuck. You know, say somebody's ill, or say we've experienced a death, then we feel this sort of a responsibility to be sad all the time. But that's not human. when we get stuck there, if I think about somebody, my father who's very sick, I could get stuck thinking, oh, he's really sick. I shouldn't enjoy anything. But what about when the sun shines? And what about when my cat does something stupid and I laugh? Or what about when I remember, my dad, taking me on a trip when I was little? Those things make me smile. And these are part of grief too. So I want to, encourage you not to make it a rock, not to make it something that you feel, trapped by, but to really open to the whole process and let it be what it's going to be. Sometimes we laugh, and sometimes we cry, and sometimes we tell stories, and sometimes we're silent, and sometimes we like things, and sometimes we don't. And it's all of this that makes us human.
I wonder if you could speak to people who are caring for their parents in their final phases. What do you do with all of a lifetime of unfinished business during that period?
Right. Oh, that's a big question. What do you do with a lifetime of unfinished business? What does unfinished business mean anyway? What is unfinished? In this moment, together with your mom or your dad or your grandma, everything is right here. So thinking that there's unfinished, things that are old, things that need to be finished, is already taken us out of the ability to be present with them right here and right now. Even so, if there are things that we need to talk about, there's no harm in trying in a gentle and loving way. But I would say ask people, gently. We can ask in ways that they can say yes more easily than no. We can lead into it with stories, or we can just dive in. Dad, there's something I always wanted to ask you about. Would that be okay? And they might surprise us and say yes. Or they may say no. Either way, we have to accept, What he might do is say, no, not now. If he says no, then say, oh, okay, maybe I'll ask you again later, okay? And sometimes they can, once they've gotten their head around the idea, could talk about it. But I think, really in thinking about unfinished business, we have to be really careful not to want somebody else to fix our problems or our own ideas or to look for some perfect solution. We can talk about difficult things, but sometimes we don't even know, who can remember? Some things are so old and we've created a story around them. So a key component is really knowing ourselves. And this we really have our practice to help us with. As we sit and follow our breath and watch our thoughts, let them go, return to the breath, our minds start to still. And as our minds become more and more quiet, less of that noise of, me, and the fears and the anxieties, those also start to still. And as our minds become more and more still, then we can see what is much more clearly. When we can see what is much more clearly, then there's less in the way between me and you. So if we can bring that into the relationship, really letting our minds still and letting go of our own stuff, then we might be surprised by what we find. Sometimes there are hidden treasures, even in the worst situations. Sometimes you learn something that is completely unexpected. And we can only do that when we let go of the stuck places, when we let go of the story that's so stuck and really start to show up to our own life as it is in this moment. And sometimes I think we really want to, magically transport back in time and fix something or address a harm, and sometimes that's just not possible. Does it mean that we love the person less? I hope not. But think about dementia. When people get dementia, they can't even remember that stuff. Sometimes that can be freeing, because if they can't remember, then there's absolutely no way to go back. But what you do have is the ability to be present together. I was thinking of that a lot with my mom recently. She has dementia. And a gift, if I can say that, dementia can be so horrible, but in the middle of it, a gift was all of our old stories between each other, between me and my mom, became irrelevant because she can't remember them. She doesn't care. She can't remember it. So she just thinks, oh, she knows I'm her daughter still. So at least we have that. So she thinks, oh, here's my daughter. I love this person. She brings me ice cream. And it was so much fun. When I last saw her, we went for ice cream every day. She got so excited. And she would tell all of her friends, we're going for ice cream today. We're going for ice cream. And going for ice cream with my mother, without our old stories, without all of our old conflicts, without those things that we never fixed, was just wonderful. We drove to the place that sells the peaches. We had fresh peaches and homemade peach ice cream in the sunshine. And my mom was so happy, and I was so happy with her. And it was such a beautiful